Wow! He's just played the move bishop b5 in the French, and just with this move, I know I have a chance to outplay him in the opening. Welcome everyone! If you want to understand the French defense, you're at the right place. I'm not a grandmaster, but I've reviewed several hours of videos and dozens of articles about the French defense, so you don't have to. By French defense, I mean this start position. This is where we're going to start from. And now, without further ado, let's check together the 9 moves you need to know in the French defense. The first move we're going to study is the move e5. It is absolutely crucial for white. And why is it? Because it grabs some space, and more space for white means less space for black, which is good for white, right? Some examples of the move e5. Of course, it can be played immediately. This is the advanced variation, but white can also play knight c3 first, and for instance after bishop b4, e5, this is the Wiener variation, but you can also play it after knight f6, this is the Steinitz variation, and here maybe it's even better because it chases the knight away. Something you need to pay attention to is that after the move e5, the pawn structure becomes static, and in particular this pawn on d4 becomes crucial to stabilize and protect the pawn on e5. Look for instance at this line where white chooses to activate pieces instead of protecting e5, and well, it's fully theoretical, but look here, that pressure that black is exerting on e5, you can understand already what is going to be white's problem here. So if we recap the pros and the cons of the move e5, first, it grabs space, which is good. But you have to be careful about the pawn on d4, which becomes really important to hold the whole pawn chain. After e5, black needs to counterattack in the center, and the easiest target for that is d4. Thus, our second move you need to know in the French defense is c5 for black. c5 is played very quickly in all the major lines of the French defense. For instance, in the advanced variation, almost immediately, but also if white plays knight c3, look, here this is the Wiener variation, white plays e5, black plays c5 immediately. And if black plays knight to f6, then also very quickly this move c5 comes to attack d4. But c5 is an excellent move as well in positions where black has exchanged on e4. Look at this theoretical line here where white has only a pawn on d4, yet black plays c5 to target this pawn as well. The move c5 is almost always good, but there is one moment where it's definitely too early to play it. It's after the move knight c3. Here, if black plays c5, white exchanges everything, and after queen takes d5, white is simply one pawn up. So c5 good, but not immediately after knight c3. Let's recap the move c5. It's almost always good. You can play it in all lines basically, but just don't play it after knight c3. Once black has played c5, well, d4 is attacked, so white needs to protect it, and a very good way to do so is a pawn on c3. Indeed, if black captures, then white recaptures and keeps the pawn chain very solid. But even after a move like knight c3, white will also try to get a pawn to c3, either by recapturing or pushing it. Some examples of the move c3, well, you have it in the advanced variation, of course, just after c5, well, you play c3, but also in this line of the Wiener, e5, c5, and here you play a3 just to force the exchange, and you end up with a pawn on c3 supporting the whole pawn chain. And there is also the Steinitz variation, which is even better. Here there is the move knight to e2. There are other moves, but knight to e2, its whole purpose is to allow a pawn to move to c3. And of course, let's mention the Tarrasch variation, where you move your knight to d2, a strange square, but the only point of doing so is to allow this pawn to move to c3 easily. Are there some drawbacks to the move c3? Well, we can say that sometimes this pawn on c3 prevents the knight to go there, so black can wait a little bit to have the knight developed on another square to exchange on c3. And look at this line of the advanced French where black is waiting for the knight to go to a3 and then only captures on d4 to exchange the pawns. Let's recap the move c3. Well, it's mostly and always a good move, reinforcing the pawn structure, but sometimes it conflicts a little bit with the move knight to c3. That's the only drawback. Now that you have this structure with the pawn on e4, how do you attack it with black? With the move f6, of course. So this is the fourth move you need to know in the French defense, and of course, if white captures, you have to think about how you recapture with black. Do you recapture with the knight, with the queen, or with the pawn? Sometimes everything is possible. As opposed to the other moves we've seen previously, the timing to play f6 really matters, and I'm going to give you two examples here. The first one is in the advanced variation. Here, after white plays a3, there is the move f6, which is good here. Another example of an early f6 is in the Steinitz variation. In this precise position, black is really happy to play f6. But I have to warn you, if you play f6 in the wrong tempo, things can really turn into a disaster really quickly for black. For instance, just an example, this diagonal is weakened and white will be able to attack it with the queen. That's one drawback. Another drawback of the move f6 is, of course, this pawn on e6 is weakened a lot, and sometimes white has a knight on d4 in the Steinitz variation, for instance, and here if you play f6 here, white immediately captures, of course, and it's a disaster for black. To summarize, the move f6, it's a good move to weaken white's pawn structure and sometimes necessary to play. But be careful, because here there can be many drawbacks. When playing f6, you can really weaken your position very quickly. Be careful. Once black has played f6, it's only very logical for white to play f2, f4. It supports the pawn on e5, but that's not all. As soon as this pawn is protected, then white can sometimes afford to exchange this pawn on c5 because e5 is protected well enough. But that's not all. There is also the move f4, f5, which starts a very powerful attack in some cases, and f takes e6 or even f6 are sometimes deadly. Here is an example in the Steinitz variation of the French defense where white plays f4, which allows him to exchange on d4 and move the knight to d4, which is a very good square for that knight. So white is leveraging this move f4 to move the knight to a better square. Are there some drawbacks to the move f4? Well, not that many, but just if you play it really too early, it can be detrimental to the other pawn chain you're trying to build, like c3, d4. And look at this line here. d4 is already really adventurous and black successfully pressures it, and here white is going to lose that pawn on d4. As we've seen, white really much likes to play e4, e5 in the French defense, but black has a very simple way to prevent that. It's to play d takes e4, and then you have a simpler variation with less to remember for black. So there are mostly two lines where this move appears. This is first directly d takes e4, or if there is bishop g5 and then only d takes e4 by black. Some limitations. Well, it makes black's life simpler, but also white's life simpler, because here white ends up with a very easy plan of playing bishop d3, castle long, knight to g5, h4, and the attack can be rolling. So black has to know also how to defend against such an attack. Another problem with the Rubinstein variation is that natural moves are giving black a very difficult position actually. Look at this line where after the exchange on f6, white is harassing the black queen. And it is not losing for black, but it's really difficult to play already. Another natural idea for black would be to develop that bishop to b7, because this bishop is a problem in the French defense. But look, if you play that, then this diagonal here is weakened and you have to play c6, else knight c6, knight e5, and it is already very, very difficult for black. So from this position, the only two moves that are playable are knight to d7 or bishop d7. You have to know that with black. The pros and the cons of d takes e4. Obviously, it is giving black a simpler position to play with less critical lines. But you have to be prepared against a potential kingside attack that can be very quick and very strong. And also, you have to know your stuff, you have to know theory, because natural moves can give you a very difficult position. In this typical French defense pawn structure, your bishop on f1 is the good bishop, so you really want it to shine and you don't want to exchange it. So that's why in the advanced variation, you never play it to b5. That's why I mentioned it in the intro. So what's the best square if you want your bishop to shine? Well, d3, of course, is the best square, because here it can really attack the king side and also potentially support a f4, f5 push. The most spectacular example, of course, is the Greek gift, where you have this sacrifice, bishop takes h7, and then the follow-up, you have to know it, knight g5, queen h5, and here in this position, after queen takes f7, this is going to be checkmate very soon. But the power of a bishop on d3 is also long-term. Here in this typical position of the Steinitz variation, this bishop on d3 will support probably a future f2, f4, f5 push that is really typical for white. There are not many drawbacks of the move bishop d3, but if I have to mention one, I would say that this pawn on d4 is of course a little bit weaker because it's no longer protected by the queen. And a good example of that is the Milner-Barry gambit, where white voluntarily gives up the pawn to d4 in exchange for a better development and attacking chances against the black king. If we summarize, bishop d3, the best square for that bishop, it's almost always good, whatever the pawn structure is. Small drawback, maybe d4 is a little less protected sometimes. Now we are looking at a very different animal. It's the move queen g4 here, with a very dangerous threat on g7. And here black has not so many ways to protect that pawn. Mostly the move king to f8 and g6, which both have some drawbacks. What are the conditions for the move queen g4 to work? Well, this bishop has to be developed because it's no longer on f8, so it doesn't protect this pawn. And white must have a pawn on e5 to prevent any black piece to go to f6. We're going to see two examples for the move queen to g4. First, a main line of the McCutcheon variation where white plays queen to g4, and this is really main, and another very famous line in the Winawer where white plays queen to g4 here, threatening g7, but here black doesn't even try to defend it, and this is called the poison pawn variation. It's a crazy line, completely crazy, and what you see here is just the beginning. Super sharp, super difficult, and first mistake you lose. So what are the limits of the move queen to g4? Well, it's usually tactically very sharp, so you have to know where you're going to. And be careful of a potential counterattack in the center from black. To summarize about the move queen to g4, very tactical, very complex, very sharp if you're into that kind of play, but also very double-edged, so one mistake and you're out, basically. And this is already the last move you need to know in the French defense. It's the move h4. What is this? Well, first of all, it's very good if black has played g6, because then h4 is targeting this weakness. But even if black doesn't play g6, you can play h4, h5, h6, and it's good. It can support also a knight on g5. If it is exchanged, then the h takes g5 move can open the file for the rook. And finally, there is a last idea to activate the rook via h3 to g3. This is an example in the Winawer variation where white plays h4, then knight c6, and here in this position, one of the best moves is actually h5. You just push the pawn. And another funny example, and one of my favorite opening lines actually, is the Alekhine-Chattar gambit, where here you play h4, and this is actually a pawn sacrifice, but there are many compensations. Look, queen to g4, and then that knight can move either to f4, g5, this bishop to d3, It's going to be targeting the pawn on h7. Very long-term attack for white, very difficult to defend for black. Fantastic line. The pros and the cons of the move h4. Well, this is a multi-purpose move which helps to support the attack, to support a knight to g5, maybe even to activate the rook. There can be many good reasons to play it. The only drawback is that, well, maybe if you play it in the wrong position, this is maybe not so necessary to play it, and you've just lost one move. Now I want to say something important. This is a brand new video format that I'm trying out, and I've put a lot of effort into this to synthesize the main ideas into a short video. So if you want me to keep going that way, please leave me a comment or hit the like button. That way I know it's worth it to keep working that much and to create more videos like that. Thank you. Now some moves that did not make it for this video. First, e takes d5. It's playable in many positions, but honestly it's rarely critical, so I did not include it. Let's mention though the move c4 later with white, which leads to isolated queens, pawns types of position. So a totally different universe actually. Then knight to f6 with black, just too obvious. If you can play it, then play it. Queen b6, interesting move for black to target at the same time b2 and d4. C takes d4. I have to mention it's really tricky with black to know exactly when it's the right time to play it. And finally bishop g5. This is the bad bishop for white, if we can say so, and it's often best used to pin this powerful knight. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you've learned a lot in this very limited time. Now learn more details about the French defense on my website pawnbreak.com. Here is the article. I put the link in the description. Go check that next, and I'll see you there.